On behalf of the Amherst Political Union, I'm thrilled to welcome all of you to our fall event, Occupy Red Room, with renowned New York Times columnist Joe Nocera. If you were expecting an Occupy rally, our publicity might have misled you a little bit, but we do think that you'll find this discussion incredibly lively and informative. The Amherst Political Union was originally founded in 1939 by longtime district attorney for Manhattan, Robert Morgenthau, and former U.S. Poet Laureate Richard Wilbur, then Amherst students. It hosted prominent speakers, including Charles Lindbergh and Eleanor Roosevelt. However, the political union died out within a few years. Luckily, in the spring of 2010, a group of passionate Amherst students revived the APU, continuing the original organization's mission of combating political apathy and fostering dialogue and debate about pressing contemporary issues. We believe that tonight's event will certainly further this mission. Tonight, we are extremely excited to welcome esteemed New York Times columnist Joe Nocera to discuss an issue that is undoubtedly on the forefront of the American political horizon. Yet while the phrase Occupy Wall Street is commonly tossed about, few of us, myself included, truly understand the underlying financial issues from which the Occupy movement has grown. Nocera will specifically address the financial issues underlying the Occupy Wall Street movement and the path forward. Following his opening remarks, there will be a question and answer period. After the event, he will be signing copies of his most recent book, All the Devils Are Here, The Hidden History of the Financial Crisis, in the lobby. We will also have hors d'oeuvres and light refreshments. Finally, we encourage you to look out for future Amherst Political Union events this year. In the spring, we will be hosting Richard Clark, counterterrorism advisor to George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. We are also planning a panel discussion on the Arab Spring, and potentially a talk by current CEO of Ford Motor, Alan Mulally. Now, without further ado, I would like to welcome the current president of the Amherst Political Union, James Fromson, to introduce Mr. Nocera.
Hey guys, thanks, Jane. So yeah, I think the publicity succeeded turning some heads, but admittedly, which was the goal, but the subtitle of tonight's talk, The Financial Issues Underlying Occupy Wall Street and the Way Forward, is really what tonight's about. Our speaker, Joe Nocera, is one of the foremost financial journalists in America. Currently, he's an op-ed columnist with the New York Times, which obviously means he can comment authoritatively about any number of subjects, but tonight's topic is his greatest area of expertise. Before moving to the op-ed page, Mr. Nocera wrote the weekly Talking Business column for the Times. Before that, he spent 10 years at Fortune magazine, finishing as the editorial director. He was also previously an editor and writer at GQ, Esquire, Newsweek, and the Washington Monthly. Mr. Nocera has won 3 Gerald Lieb Awards for excellence in financial journalism and was a 2007 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His book, A Piece of the Action, How the Middle Class Joined the Money Class, and won the New York Public Library's award for Best Nonfiction Book of 1995, and his latest work, All the Devils Are Here, The Hidden History of the Financial Crisis, which, as Jane mentioned, he'll be signing outside after this, got rave reviews and is a New York Times bestseller. Finally, Mr. Nocera is a former longtime resident of the Pioneer Valley, Northampton to be precise, and knows this area well. So please join me in welcoming him back to his old haunts and to Amherst College.
All right, am I going to need a mic or not?
Why not?
No. I am going to need the whole floor, though.
Hey, I tried to get some PR.
I don't need PR. It turns out, because I got the Amherst Political Union. So this is how you write speeches now. You put them on your iPad. Have you guys seen the YouTube video where they put a bunch of 2-year-olds in front of magazines, and they just go trying to figure out why can't I do that? So I'm going to do a little of that. I'm going to have to stop every once in a while to do this, but bear with me. I am very happy to be here, see old friends, see new friends, meet people from Amherst College. I just want to say before I start, the only Amherst College student I really knew well before tonight was a young man named Zalmay Yawa. And I don't know if any of you remember Zalmay when he was here, which was not all that long ago. He was Scott Simon's translator in Afghanistan. It's an amazing story. He learned to read English by getting the books, the English language books that the Taliban was burning. This is not a joke. And taking them home and then matching words as he was trying to read by listening to the BBC. And by the time the Afghanistan war had begun, he was old enough and ambitious enough so that when journalists began covering it, he became a translator first, I believe, for the Boston Globe and then for NPR. And when Scott came back to the U.S. and Zalmay expressed an interest in coming to college in the United States, Scott helped him apply to Amherst College, where he went and very successfully and graduated with a degree in geology, I believe, and is now getting his PhD at Indiana University and is a professor. So that's what Amherst College can do. So thank you, Amherst College, for that. The Amherst Political Union played bait and switch. I thought I was going to come here talking about the financial crisis and its aftermath, but it turns out Occupy Red Room. Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Philadelphia, Occupy Los Angeles, which got all taken down yesterday. I want to start by talking about a one percenter, and a different one percenter than you think. There is at this school, I believe, something called the Merrill Science Center. Is that correct? Charlie Merrill is the Merrill for whom the Merrill Science Center is named after. Charlie Merrill never actually graduated from Amherst College. He just went for a couple of years, but he always viewed this as his school. So much so that after he had recovered from these debilitating bouts of whatever he had, he came to Amherst for a reunion, got sick again, and was dead 10 days later. I had a lot of fun that weekend, though. Charlie Merrill founded Merrill Lynch. And in addition to giving a lot of money to Amherst College, he was one of the more interesting people to ever be on Wall Street. His era began in about 1906 or 1907, and it ended more or less when he died in the late 1950s. And he did two things that I'd like to just briefly mention that I think are important. He invented the phrase bringing Wall Street to Main Street. And he believed firmly in the democratization of finance. And he believed that the little guy should be an investor. And he believed that the markets shouldn't be rigged the way they were in those days. And he encouraged average Americans to get into the market. His whole life was spent doing that, which is why Merrill Lynch became the largest brokerage in the United States. The second thing he did that I think is of value is at a time when all the big investment banks, I got to tell you a story about his son too, but we'll get that in a minute. The other thing he did was at a time when all the big investment banks only underwrote the big, powerful railroads and the other dynamic or established companies, he underwrote supermarket chains. His grandson, Peter McGowan, was the CEO of Safeway for many years because grandfather Charlie had underwritten it. He was a one percenter. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country. When he died, his obituary was on the front page of the New York Times. He was a one percenter who did something that was socially useful. I got to tell you the story about his son. And then I'll get back to my speech. His son, James, who died 6 or 7 years ago of AIDS, was one of our country's finest poets, had no interest in Wall Street or his father's work, and had a very contentious relationship with his father his entire life. James went to Amherst too, actually graduated. And it was at Amherst that James started to write poetry. And it's also at Amherst that James had his first homosexual affair with a professor. You could do that then. And when Charlie Merrill found out about this affair, he actually said to somebody, "Can we get the professor killed?" The 1%ers aren't always, the answer turned out to be no. And then he turned out, when he realized that his son he actually solicited the professor then and said, "Does my son have professional talent as a poet?" And when the professor said yes, then everything was okay. The point of the Charlie Merrill story is that he was a person of Wall Street who did something socially useful. And that Wall Street, once upon a time, did do socially useful things. It underwrote companies. It raised capital for companies. And in some cases, it democratized finance to level the playing field to allow people to invest for their retirements and for their kids' college education. So, point one about Occupy. Can I just say Occupy? Just like. What does Wall Street do today that's socially useful? We went through this crisis, and part of what created this crisis was that Wall Street was trading basically vehicles that were not only socially non-useful, unuseful, they were socially destructive. Now, at the time, when the crisis first happened, everybody heard about these phrases: subprime mortgages, collateralized debt obligations, all those sort of phrases. What did they mean? What do they mean? There's two ways to thinking about this, and I want to talk a little bit about both of them. One is the Wall Street way of thinking about it, and then I want to talk a little bit about the Main Street way of thinking about it, which has become much more apparent in the aftermath of the crisis as we've gone through the set of foreclosure issues. On Wall Street, these were simply vehicles that allowed people to trade. That's all they did. They had no other utility. They allowed people to make bets on, and they were rated AAA, and they were supposed to be safe. They actually allowed banks to game the capital requirements. That's one of the reasons banks got in so much trouble. What does that mean exactly? What that means is banks at that point had switched to capital rules. The rules, the amount of capital you have to hold in reserve in case you get losses, okay, which is pretty important, I would say. It's one of the reasons all the European banks are about to go down, because they're still so woefully undercapitalized. But if you could get a AAA on a subprime bond, you didn't have to put any capital against that because it was AAA, see? So you'd create these bonds, and you'd sell them to the banks, and the banks would buy them, and they'd have AAA, so they wouldn't have to put much capital by. Oh, and by the way, if you wanted to get rid of all the capital, the tiny little sliver that might be left, you bought you bought some insurance from AIG. Yeah. AIG actually had a name for this. It's in the book. They didn't exactly call it regulatory gaming, but that's kind of what the word meant, regulatory gaming. I mean, they all thought it was free money. So, what's the social utility of that? Zero. Now, let's talk about Main Street. You don't really think about this a lot unless you're actually out there. But one of the things that I've done in the last year and a half or so is I've actually gone to neighborhoods that are beleaguered with foreclosures. You go to Jamaica, New York. Every third house is either abandoned or in foreclosure. These neighborhoods will not recover for 30 years. People are devastated. They're trying desperately to get mortgage modifications, but they can't. The banks give them the runaround. The lawyers stink. They have no help. Actually, they do have help, which I'm going to get to at the end of my speech. And you look at these houses, half of them fallen down, you know, really, really devastated neighborhoods. And you think to yourself, this is the kindling upon which the financial crisis was built? These were the houses upon which the loans were made that were turned into collateralized debt obligations and were sold to Wall Street as AAA securities? So not only is it socially useless from Wall Street's point of view, it's incredibly socially destructive from Main Street's point of view. Point one. So here's the second thing the occupiers are a little upset about. Nobody's in jail. Nobody's in jail. Angelo Mozzilla's not in jail. He paid $20 million out of his own pocket after, by the way, walking away with $147 million severance when he left the company. I once asked the Department of Justice, I said, forget about Angelo Mozzillo. You know, think about Countrywide for a second. Did Countrywide commit fraud? How do we know that? How do we know that? Part of the reason we know that is because Countrywide is now giving back or taking back loans from Fannie and Freddie and from insurance and many of the mortgage insurance companies in which they're litigating on the grounds that they were made fraudulent to begin with. So they violated the terms of the agreement when they made the loan. So I said to the Department of Justice, I said, forget about Angelo Mozzillo, forget about the CFO, forget about all the top executives. Have you prosecuted a single person from Countrywide? One person? No, they haven't done that. Have you prosecuted Dick Fuld? No, we haven't done that. And then when I ask them why not, they say, well, you wouldn't understand, you're not a lawyer. Okay. In the S&L crisis, a far, far, far less severe crisis than this one, 1,000 people went to jail. 1,000 people. And I'll tell you something, not every one of those 1,000 people were actually guilty of a crime. Honestly, they weren't. Some of them really did do just dumb things. Some of them committed crimes, but some of them just did dumb things. But the country demanded some retribution. And the government responded by being unbelievably aggressive, which it's not anymore. Is it hard to make cases against these people? Yes, it is. It is. It's definitely hard. But it was hard to make the case against the Enron guys, too. Incredibly complicated case. Really difficult to figure out how to make a case against Jeff Skilling. The company went down. He said it was just a series of bad business decisions. They did nothing that wasn't approved by their accountants and their lawyers. He's in jail. Angelo Mozzillo said he did nothing that wasn't approved by his accountants and his lawyers. He paid $20 million and walked away. So yeah, people are upset about that. I'm upset about that. So here's the next thing people are upset about. The banking industry is acting like nothing ever happened. Crisis? What crisis? Jamie Dimon gets in front of Ben Bernanke and he berates him for all the regulations. The banking industry has done a powerfully good job of persuading legislators that they're being overregulated now by Dodd-Frank. And it's onerous and it's unfair. And it's going to put the community banks out of business, and and you know there are a lot of regulations now, and some of them maybe overlap, and but you know what? We need some of these regulations. We need a lot of these regulations. Banks have our money. Our money is insured by the federal government. in return for that insurance, the country has a right to expect things from the banking industry. They do. There's a reason the reason we had Glass-Steagall is that it was generally believed that that banking should be boring. That's what it should be. It should be really boring. And so if you were a bank, if you were a commercial bank, and you had deposit insurance, you were expected to do simple, easy, unrisky things. And if you were an investment bank, you were allowed to do risky things because you could go out of business. Now, I actually don't particularly advocate bringing back Glass-Steagall, and the reason I don't is because I do understand that our large banks would be at a competitive disadvantage with other countries' large banks, and that our large companies need an array of services which include a certain amount of risk-taking by the bank. I get that. But that doesn't mean there shouldn't be rules around that to safeguard our money, to safeguard the taxpayer. And so when the banks say we're not responsible for anything, it's not our fault, crises just happen every once in a while. Actually, they don't just happen every once in a while. That's one of the interesting things about crises. We didn't have a major crisis in this country from the mid-30s until not all that long ago. Those rules that were put in place in the 1930s did a pretty darn good job. Now, one of the interesting things, I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's okay. One of the interesting things about those rules is how radical they were. I've always loved that about them. Think about what they did in the 1930s. They said to Morgan, we're going to split you in two. Can you imagine if you went to Jamie Dimon today and said, we're going to split your company in two. We're going to put the banking over here. We're going to put the investment bank. They'd go nuts. One of the reasons that happened is because the country got to see, in a way that it hasn't gotten to see this time, the venality that took place in the run-up to the crash of 1929 through the Pecora hearings, which lasted not a matter of weeks or months, and they didn't have every senator talking for 5 minutes. They had a guy named Ferdinand Pecora, who was the chief counsel, asking questions for hours and hours and hours. It was like the Watergate Committee. And the country didn't watch it on TV, but they were riveted in the newspaper. And that constant exposure aroused the anger and set the mood, so that when we got to the point when the government was proposing to put the SEC on the table, to create an SEC, and when it was proposing to institute Glass-Steagall, a radical law, the likes of which we haven't seen since, there was almost no opposition in Congress. There was no pushback. It really is kind of amazing. Of course, they were all Democrats. So the next thing that's annoying is not just that the banks are acting like nothing's happening, but that Congress is acting like nothing ever happened. Now, that's not quite true. We have a law called Dodd-Frank. And I actually don't want to minimize Dodd-Frank. I think there are aspects of it that could be truly important. People say constantly that too big to fail still exists. I don't actually think it does. I think that if a major American bank were to go bust today, that there is a high likelihood under the law that they would be, that they in fact would be resolved, as they call it, and wound down. The law is very clear about this, and the banks are actually in the process of creating what are called living wills, which are exactly what they think they are, where they explain to the government what happens if they have to be wound down, where the different pieces go, what the counterparties are, what the risk is, and so on and so forth. The second thing Dodd-Frank does is it created a Consumer Protection Bureau, which actually could be quite effective if they could ever get a director. One of the great ironies of the Republican resistance to naming a director, and this is sort of hard to understand why the banks the banks are paying for all of this, of course, this resistance. As long as there's no director, the Consumer Protection Bureau can regulate all the institutions that are already regulated by the United States government, i.e. the banks. The minute they get a director under the law, they will be allowed to regulate all the institutions that are not regulated right now by the United States government. The mortgage originators, the payday lenders, all the bottom feeders that the banks complain about constantly, saying they undercut their business with unfair business practices. Never mind. Derivatives, another thing that desperately needs to be regulated. Now, if you read All the Devils Are Here by Joe Nocera and Bethany McLean, you'd know the whole backstory about Brooksley Born and how she tried to do it in the 90s and how she was pushed around by Rubin and Greenspan and the free market boys. And what's happening today is not all that dissimilar. So what's really happened is the Democrats passed this law while the getting was good. Then you have the midterms. Democrats get their butts kicked. Republicans sweep in, vowing vengeance. Now, they can't roll back the law because the Senate is still in Democratic hands and the president still, at least for now, is Barack Obama. But they sure can make life hell. And that's what they've been doing. Their attitude about the financial crisis is like the 9th season of Dallas. For those of you who remember Dallas, the 9th season is the one where the woman, Pam wakes up and she realizes the entire 8th season was a dream. And so that's how the Republicans have been acting about the financial crisis. It never really happened. What problem? What crisis? What are you talking about? So they decide to make Elizabeth Warren a punching bag. And they bring her before Congress not once, not twice, not 3 times. They bring her a half a dozen times. They box her about the ears. They complain vociferously about the fact that the Consumer Bureau has its own budget, that it only has a director and not a 5-person commission, that Richard Selby, who used to be a voice of reason in the Senate but is now a crank, just like, never mind, says that he, over his dead body, will she ever become the director? And so she does not become the director. Of course, the ironic thing is she becomes a rock star and could well be your next senator. We call this the law of unintended consequences. On derivatives, what's happening is even worse. Gary Gensler, who is one of the heroes, one of the unsung heroes really in all of this, a former Goldman managing director who was at the Treasury with Rubin in the late 90s and who is, don't tell him I said this, he's trying to atone for his sins. I mean, he is. And he is working really hard to implement the enormously complex set of rules that is required of him under the law, trying to make derivatives more transparent, which would bring prices down, by the way. Trying to make it so that they're less dangerous, so that the collapse of a derivative market or a CDO exposure or whatever will not bring down the financial system. Gee, that's all he's trying to do. Can't let him do that, can you? And what is the net result? Congress is cutting they're already understaffed. They're wildly understaffed. They're being asked to do so much more than they ever had to do before. Their staff is being cut like crazy. Their budget's being cut like crazy. They barely have their head above water. That's how if you want to fight legislation that's in the works, and you do it through the regulators. You kill the regulators. And of course, because we are in a time of quote-unquote austerity and there's a mood to cut the budget, there's surprisingly little resistance in the Senate for maintaining the robust budget for the agency, for the commodities, the futures agency that the president originally asked for. So, you know, they not only are not getting the additional $100 million, they're going to get less than, probably going to get even less than they're using now. That's how you do this. Now now I'm going to come back to, of course, the reason that we all know that Occupy Wall Street is upset, and that is the 1%. I hope you all read, by the way, the story in the Times on Sunday about Ronald Lauder. Huge story about his taxes and how little he pays. And everything he does is legal. Everything he does is legal. But he pays a whole lot less taxes than you do, percentage-wise, because the article doesn't say this, but really the implication of the article is there are two tax systems. There's a tax system for guys like him, and there's a tax system for the rest of us. And to me, it was a very powerful example of how very wealthy people who want to avoid taxes can by, you know, using the tax code to their utmost advantage. I was at Yale yesterday. I mean, I'm living high these days. Yale, Amherst, I mean, who knows where tomorrow will bring. I was on a panel with Jacob Hacker, the great political scientist, and he was talking about volatility, but he had a slide that really caught my eye. So it was a chart. Of course, if I was technologically literate, which I'm not, I'd show you the slide, but instead I'm just going to have to read it. Between 1979 and 2007, income for the poorest fourth of the country grew 16%. This is almost over a 28-year span. Yeah, there you go. The next fifth or fourth, 23% over a 28-year span. That's how much their incomes rose. The middle quartile, 25%. The people in the 80 to 99% tax bracket, their incomes went up 59%. And the top 1% over that 28-year period went up 281%. And then in the case of Wall Street, you know, they make the most. And they, you know, as we said, you know, you sort of wonder why and on what grounds. And you think, well, at least, you know, Jeff Immelt makes $9 or $10 million too, but at least he makes jet engines. Now, I want to tell you a little story, and I want to tell you a little story. I was actually in the room when the 1% was invented. I was. It was 1982. And I had just moved to Texas. And my first assignment as a 29-year-old, green behind the ears magazine journalist was to profile a guy named Boone Pickens. He ran an oil company. He ran a natural gas company. And he had never taken over another company before. And Texas Monthly was interested in him. And he was kind of getting to be a big shot in Texas. So I went to his home in Amarillo, Texas, and had my very first fried catfish. Highly recommend it. And some puy fuse, as he used to say. He doesn't say it that way anymore. And in the course of that conversation, I didn't know that much about business. And I'd never heard anybody talk about the things that he was talking about. Companies belonged to shareholders, and corporate executives were empire builders, and they needed to understand that the shareholder was the owner, and they needed to work for the shareholder. And they needed to align, and here's the key sentence, they needed to align their own interest with the interest of the shareholder. 2 months after that, Boone did his first hostile takeover. And the era of the hostile takeover where him and Carl Icahn and Michael Milken and all those characters from the 1980s were in their heyday. And by God, they changed the country. They changed the business culture. And by God, CEOs stopped building their empires, but they also stopped making 10 times more than the most junior employee, and they started making 20 times, and then 30 times. And then why were they doing that? Why were they doing that? Because they were aligning their interest with the shareholders. Right? Right? Isn't that what they were doing? They were getting stock options. They were getting rich is what they were getting. And a social compact, the focus on shareholders, which seemed like a good thing at the time, broke down a social compact that existed in corporations about the divide between how much the top guy gets and how much the bottom guy gets. And this compact became exacerbated as we went through, rounds of layoffs where, guys like Chainsaw, what was his last name? Al Chainsaw, you know this, Tom. I know you do. Thank you! would actually boast about how much he was going to make because he was cutting 20,000 people from this company and 30,000 from that. At a certain point, people started to wake up and say, this is kind of out of control here. CEO is making 100 times more than the average employee, and then 150 times. And then President Clinton signed a law saying that everything over $1 million that a CEO got in cash couldn't be deducted from the company's taxes. I think that's what it was. So what did they all do? What did they all do? They capped their salaries at $1 million and larded up on restricted stock and stock options. Nothing changed. So the next thing was, okay, can't do that. Let's try to emphasize pay for performance. That's a good way to do this. Fine, you'll get rewarded if you perform, if the stock really does well. So what happens? The definition of performance gets redefined. If the stock goes down. If it goes up, then fine, pay for performance. If it goes down, well, revenues were good. Return on capital. Well, actually, return on capital is important. Never mind. And so it eventually becomes pay for pulse instead of pay for performance. And, the Tea Party likes to talk about crony capitalism. Boards of directors are crony capitalism. That is the essence of crony capitalism. You got a bunch of CEOs that you've picked. Maybe you sit on their board. Everybody's got a vested interest in seeing that the CEO makes a ton of money. You hire compensation consultants. They're all aligned with your interest. Oh, and by the way, you can't just pay them. You got to put them in the top 25% percentile of all the CEOs in your industry. So of course, then the next guy comes. Oh, I'm only in the 50% percentile, and it just ratchets up and up and up and up and up. The reason I dwell on this, and the reason I sort of connected in my mind to Occupy Wall Street, is wrestling with the problem of the 1%, wrestling with the problem of executive compensation is really, really hard. Every person who's tried to solve it has failed. Lucian Bebchuk at Harvard has written paper after paper about executive compensation and tried to develop schemes for appropriately compensating bank executives. Nothing works. Nothing stops it. I was quoted in the Gazette yesterday. Big day for me. I was on the front page of the Gazette. I was quoted in the Gazette saying that if we had that the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street stem from the same root. That if we lived in a country where the middle class felt like they could get ahead, that their children were going to have a better life than they were, that you could get a job, that you could have a job maybe in manufacturing, gosh, what about that? That if people felt that life was going to be better, there would be no Tea Party, and I don't believe there would be any Occupy Wall Street. But we don't live in that country, and I admire the Tea Party. I admire them. I don't like their politics, but I admire them. Occupy Wall Street's anger has been directed towards the banks and the 1%, by and large. Their view is that those are the people who need to be dealt with, and that both for interests of fairness and for punishment and for changing the system and so on and so forth. The Tea Party believes that the people who should be dealt with and punished and is government itself, and that the way to change the country is to shrink the government. Now, you don't have to like that. You don't have to, you can think it's completely wrong-headed. But I am here to tell you that their view is one that they come by honestly. It's what they really believe. And the way they dealt with this is that they went out and they kicked out congressmen they didn't like and elected congressmen who basically genuflect before them, and who are so willing to shrink the government that they would actually allow the United States government to go in default, which I find mind-boggling. But they believe that only by such drastic measures will you actually shrink government, and that anything short of that will allow the same old and government to grow and so on and so forth. That's what they believe. And the way they dealt with it was to use the political process to their own benefit. Occupy Wall Street is not really occupying anything right now, just because cities have had enough and parks need to be cleaned and mayors are throwing up their hands. But ultimately, sitting in a park isn't going to do it. It's just not. So when you look at the problems that I've talked about and that they care about, what do you do about compensation? What do you do about the power of the lobby, the bank lobbies that push back sensible regulations? What do you do to a political culture that's so corrupt? What do you do? To me, the question about Occupy Wall Street is whether they will follow the model of the Tea Party and get involved in the political process. And I don't just mean get involved, but I mean target and make themselves a force and do something to actually change things, like the Tea Party did. That's the question I have for them. And now, oh my God, I talked for a long time. Now let's take questions from you. Yes, sir.
I think that you're not noticing something very important. The Occupy movement is basically, since I have only a few words here, I'll try to be succinct. It looks at the political system and it says it's immoral. The politicians give priority not to the common good, but to the people who give them the money to get elected. They look at the corporations, they say it's immoral. They give priority to the interests of the shareholders. They look at the nation states and they say, oh, they're giving priority to their citizens versus everybody else. The reason that the Occupy is so focused on the way they're living in their tent towns is because they're trying to figure out how to do it directly themselves, because they realize that the next stage is to set up new freestanding institutions inside this wonderful democracy that we live in that will solve some of these social problems that truly do give priority to the common good. So that's, I think, the direction that the Occupy is going to end up going in, which is a very, very different direction from what anybody is thinking about at this time.
Well, actually, there was a story in the American Banker has hired a lefty columnist, and he wrote a very good column today about how how some of the people in Occupy Wall Street are talking seriously about trying to start their own bank. And I think that's a super interesting idea. There's no reason that couldn't happen. Along the lines that you're saying, I mean, that's a sensible idea, to create an alternative bank that came at banking in a different way, that was more oriented towards people's needs and so on and so forth. I still think, however, as corrupt as you may think the political system is and as immoral as it is, if you're not willing to do something about that directly, you know, they're always going to have the last word.
May I say one more thing?
I don't have that much time.
No, you don't. I'm setting up an organization right now that is going to be the world's first membership-directed endowment fund, which will create
I'll
capital.
talk to you about this afterwards.
Okay, all I'm trying
It's
to
the best
say
I'm
is
going to do
that
for it.
There are ways to do these things other than doing
Okay.
it in a normal way.
That's right.
Yes, sir.
So, earlier you said that banks today do, the sort of securitization of mortgages provides no social benefit. This is something I personally don't necessarily disagree with. I disagree with, because securitization mortgages lowered interest rates on homes by 50 basis points or something. A lot of these other things.
I didn't say securitization of mortgages per se were socially. All these things, all of these creations often start with a good reason. Securitizations of mortgages did make it possible to create more mortgages for more people. There's nothing necessarily wrong. What happens is that then it becomes a thing unto itself, and it gets bundled and it gets perverted and so on and so forth.
Right. So I was going to more. That was kind of where my question was actually going. Is that since banks play such just an important role in society, when banks had more money, they everyone had free checking, and now there were talks of having $5 charges on debit cards. At least there was. How do we rectify this? Banks that actually do provide some social utility while trying to prevent some of the bad things without destroying it outright.
There's a lot of banks out there. Nobody says you have to bank at Wells Fargo, Citi, JP Morgan, and Bank of America. I couldn't believe when I drove off exit 18, there's a big sign that says, you know, sick of your bank, come see us, Florence Savings. Something like that. So there, you know, are you going to be able to reform Bank of America yourself? No, but you know, I'm pretty sympathetic to the idea that if you don't think a big bank is practicing banking the way it ought to be banked, you should find a smaller community bank which need help. Yes, sir.
Do you think you'll ever get a satisfactory answer as to why no one's gone to jail?
No, I don't. Boy, that's a good question. I don't think I'm ever going to get a satisfactory answer. I do. I hypothesize about it a lot.
Is it just Obama trying to be too?
It's not a function of Obama.
No.
It has much more to do with U.S. attorneys across the country. The U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, who is the most important figure on this sort of thing, has, he, before the financial crisis, he bet the rent on the insider trading cases that led to the conviction of the Raj. And I personally believe that all the big-time financial white-collar resources that they had were spent on that, and so when the financial crisis came along, they really didn't have much left. The SEC doesn't have the ability to put anybody in jail. And the thing that I've really been offended by is if you go to these U.S. attorneys and you look at their press releases, you see all these press releases about, oh, we're tough on mortgage fraud. Look at, we put this guy in jail, we put that guy in jail, and they turn out to be these think-ass little nobodies who don't have the wherewithal to stand up to the U.S. attorneys and, fall on their sword and spend 6 months in jail. It's absurd. And you see this time and time and time again. And And so when you call them and say, well, you're not prosecuting mortgage fraud, they say, well, you know, look at all the cases, look at all the people we put in jail. And you say, well, yeah, but it's not anybody who matters. And I think that, I also do think that this Justice Department does shy away from tackling, you know, they only did try one case. The two Bear Stearns guys whose hedge fund collapsed 6 months before Bear Stearns went under. And they prosecuted those guys. They thought they had some damning emails. But the truth of the matter is, if you looked at those emails in their totality, while they showed anxiety, they also showed these guys sort of talking themselves into, oh, everything's going to be okay. And the jury found them not guilty. And I really do believe that the loss of that case just kind of caused the Justice Department to like freeze and to not want to do any more cases. I think that's a lot. So they're much happier just having a financial settlement, saying, you know, victory for the people, and moving on. Yes, sir.
You intimated that you admired the success of the tactics of the Tea Party in going after their political process. And
Wow.
it gets better.
Let me, wow. In other words, the audience was so still.
Don't go after the Tea Party.
Go ahead.
Given that, is it a credible extension to say the way to go after the corporate dysfunction that we're in is to go after the boardroom?
Yes, absolutely.
And that to go and concentrate not on sitting in parks, but go after voting for particular boards and composition of those boards. There have been various efforts to empower shareholders to elect board members directly, and to nominate board members directly in opposition to already sitting board members. It's been a very, very, very tough fight. It's sort of always on the verge of happening, but it never quite happens. But the people that I talk to who are in favor of reforming executive pay and reforming corporate governance believe that the most powerful thing you could do would be to able to nominate a board member, who the CEO hasn't nominated, to nominate a board member who can then contest an election against specifically targeted at a board member whose votes on compensation, for instance, you don't like. I think that could do an absolute world of good. But corporate America fights it like crazy. The courts are kind of ambiguous about it. The SEC promulgates rules, but I don't know that they've ever taken effect. But I'm convinced that this is kind of the way to go. So I think that's a good thought. Yes, ma'am.
I have a follow-up to the Tea Party tactic
Mhm.
thing. And my question is really for the students in the room, that if you are eligible to vote in the United States, please walk yourself down to the town hall, register to vote in Massachusetts, get somebody of yourselves to agree to be a caucus delegate, go to the caucus en masse in February, vote for one of yourselves to represent who you want to be the Massachusetts Democratic senator, and go vote for Elizabeth Warren.
Why did I know that was going to be your last line? So we got, yes, sir.
I know you talked about the occupation, the Occupy Wall Street, as if it was a monolith. There are people there from all walks of life. Now we're hearing about people who had nowhere to stay because they lost their bank account, they became unemployed, they had nowhere to go. They lived in a trailer, they had to sell the trailer. Then you have Michael Moore coming there, and Naomi Klein, and this one. So the point is that you can't, you have to understand that basically the people there are frustrated for a variety of reasons with the system that they're living in and what they have. And they're reacting. It's a reaction to the conditions. So you seem to have had some solution, what they should do. And they heard about what they should do for many, many, many years, and their grandmothers in Florida told what they should do to go to law school. So they went to law school, and now they have no practice because the people don't have $300 an hour. All I'm saying is that this thing has to be viewed in the context of what develops from it, not what you see now. Your evaluation of the banks is good, that they're a bunch of crooks.
I'm glad you're going to give me that. Thank you, sir.
You woke me up, I had to give it to you.
Last question, sir.
I'm curious, how do you think of the appointment of Larry Summers and Tim Geithner impacted how the executive branch approached the financial crisis?
All right, let me how much time do we have? Here's what I believe about that. Let me start with the president. The president had deep, powerful, well-formed thoughts about healthcare, about education, about various other public policy issues that he had been involved with for much of his career. He had no feel for finance at all. And he was, he had a mind meld with Geithner, and Geithner became Treasury Secretary, and Larry Summers overwhelmed him with his intelligence, as Larry Summers tends to do. So Larry Summers, whatever you think about his set of ideas, was horribly miscast in his role as a quote-unquote neutral broker of ideas that were supposed to be presented to the president. And so everything that filtered through Larry Summers came out as a Larry Summers idea, and Larry was not helpful to the president, ultimately, because he did not believe that they should really apologize for anything that had happened in the late 90s when he was Treasury Secretary or Rubin's deputy. He fundamentally still is a believer in the modern tools that Wall Street uses. I mean, that's kind of the way he thinks. He just wasn't a force for good. And the president, the president didn't really know who else to talk to. Now, Geithner's slightly different. It is true that Geithner is an apparatchik, and it is also true that he has spent his entire life around banks. And on issues that Obama should have felt in his soul, help homeowners, for God's sake. There was $30 billion in TARP that Barney Frank put there specifically to help for mortgage modification. And Geithner just let it sit there, never did anything with it. And every effort the Treasury Department has made on the foreclosure issue has been a day late and a dollar short. Geithner has no feel for those kind of issues, and the president, who's a Democratic president who absolutely should have a feel for those issues, doesn't, in part because he's listening to Geithner. Having said that, I believe that the reason that our banks are not crumbling the way Europe's are right now is because the one really good thing Geithner has done in the past 3 years is insist that our banks shore up their capital. The stress test that was conducted several years ago, which most people rolled their eyes at and didn't take seriously, turned out to be enormously important because it told the market what the relative safety of our banks were and how much capital they really needed to raise in order to be viewed as safe by the United States government. And by God, they were able to go out and raise the capital. And our four big banks right now, even Bank of America with all its problems, have plenty of capital. And that's why, when Greece defaults, that's right, when Greece defaults, and if Italy defaults, the German banks are dead. They have no capital. what Angela Merkel is doing, why Germany won't do what it needs to do to save the Eurozone is beyond me, because their banks are the ones that are going to collapse. But that's not my problem. Geithner has done a good job in terms of shoring up the banks, and it's not unimportant. The problem is, on every other issue imaginable, he hasn't done a good job. And yet, Obama is so dependent on him for advice that when he wanted to quit 6 or 8 months ago, Obama basically begged him to hold on to the job. So.
Is there anyone else?
Well, I always thought Sheila Bair would be a good Treasury Secretary, but he's not listening to me these days. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. I so appreciated it. Thank you.